When the lockdown alarm rings, everything changes. In a heartbeat, the school you thought you knew becomes unfamiliar. Desks turn into hiding spots. Hallways feel endless. Every sound, a creak, a whisper, a breath, suddenly means something else. In those tense moments, you don't think about your next class. You think about surviving. We are told lockdowns are for our protection. That it's just a drill. That everything's under control. But what happens when the danger isn't outside? What happens when the threat is already inside the building, waiting, watching, maybe even whispering your name? Tonight, you'll hear 3 disturbing stories, not passed down like urban legends, but told by those who lived through them. A classroom sealed long ago, reopened for a group that never should have entered. A mysterious student no one remembers, wearing the same uniform, year after year. And a voice over the intercom that guided students into silence, but wasn't from anyone alive. These aren't stories about fire drills or forgotten backpacks. These are stories that stay with you long after the lights come back on. Welcome to 3 disturbing true school lockdown stories. Good day! Let me tell you about something that happened at Blackwood High not too long ago. It was during that massive lockdown when the whole town went quiet as a mouse. You know how schools can feel eerie when they're empty? Well, this was something else entirely. A group of Year 12 students found themselves directed to room 207, a classroom that had been sitting vacant for months after a bizarre fire that no one could properly explain. The macabre history of that room wasn't common knowledge, but the older teachers would clam up whenever it was mentioned. The students shuffled in reluctantly, not knowing why they'd been sent to this particular room when it hadn't been used since the incident. The caretaker had sworn he'd locked it up tight, reckoned it wasn't safe. Yet here they were, 6 teenagers huddled together in a classroom that smelled of smoke and something else, something terrorizante that lingered beneath the chemical cleaners. The walls still showed faint scorch marks reaching up like skeletal fingers, despite multiple attempts to paint over them. Just stay quiet and wait for further instructions, their teacher had whispered before locking them in from the outside. At first, they did what teenagers do, rolled their eyes, pulled out their phones, and tried to make the best of it. But the reception was cactus in room 207. Always had been, even before the fire. Janie whispered that her older sister said it was because of what happened in the 90s, but before she could elaborate, they heard it. A soft tap 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 from inside the supply cupboard at the back of the room. Ryan reckoned it was just the pipes, but everyone knew the plumbing didn't run through that wall. Besides, there was something deliberate about the sound, something that sent an irreverent feeling crawling up their spines. Maybe it's a possum, suggested MIA, but her voice trembled as she said it. None of them moved toward the cupboard to check. They'd seen enough horror films to know better, yeah. The tapping stopped for a moment, and they all let out the breath they'd been holding. Then came the whispering, so faint you could barely make it out, but unmistakably human, or something pretending to be. Crikey, the way it seemed to float around the room, sometimes sounding like it was right behind you, then across the room in a blink, it was doing their heads in. The supernatural quality of those whispers made them huddle closer together. The clock on the wall seemed frozen at 2:07, though they'd been in the room for what felt like hours. Outside, the sky had darkened prematurely, as though something was swallowing the light. "We should check the cupboard," said Ben eventually, more to break the silence than anything else. But Cassie grabbed his arm, her fingers leaving white marks on his skin. "Don't," she hissed. "Just don't." There was real meadow in her eyes, the kind that comes from knowing something the others don't. Later, they'd learned that Cassie's mother had been a teacher at the school during the incident, though she never spoke about what actually happened. The tapping had evolved into a rhythmic knocking now, growing louder with each passing minute. What made it truly terrifying was that the cupboard door was visibly secured with a padlock from the outside. Whatever was making those sounds was locked in there, and had been for months. Ryan, trying to be the tough guy, pulled out his phone to record the sound. "No one's gonna believe this," he muttered, pointing his camera toward the cupboard. But when they watched the footage back, the knocking couldn't be heard. Instead, a child's laughter played clearly through the tinny speakers, though none of them had heard it in real time. The temperature in room 207 plummeted suddenly, their breath fogging in the air despite it being the middle of summer. The aircon hadn't worked since the fire, so there was no logical explanation for the cold that seemed to seep into their bones. MIA's teeth chattered as she whispered, "I don't reckon we are supposed to be here." Too right, that room had been off limits for reasons that were becoming clearer by the minute. The macabre atmosphere thickened as shadows in the corners appeared to shift and elongate, reaching toward them with indistinct fingers that retracted whenever someone looked directly at them. The whispers from the cupboard had formed into words now, though none of them would later agree on what was said. Janie heard a warning, Ben heard a plea for help, and Cassie swore it was reciting their full names, one by one. The only thing they did agree on was the terrorizing feeling that whoever, or whatever, was speaking knew them personally. Knew things about them they'd never told anyone. The kind of things that make you wake up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, wondering if you're really alone in your room. You know that feeling, don't you? When you're certain someone's watching, even when you know you're alone? Ben had had enough. "This is bullshit," he declared, standing up and marching toward the door. But the handle wouldn't turn, though no one had heard it lock. He yanked harder, his face growing redder by the second. "Let us out," he shouted, pounding on the door. No one came. It was as if this part of the school had been forgotten, cut off from the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the knocking from the cupboard had stopped, replaced by a terrible silence that was somehow worse. The absence of sound hung heavy in the air, an irreverent vacuum that seemed to be building toward something none of them wanted to witness. "Does anyone else smell that?" whispered MIA suddenly. At first, they thought she meant the lingering smoke scent, but this was different, the metallic tang of blood mixed with something sweeter, like burnt sugar. It wafted from the direction of the cupboard in waves, growing stronger with each passing moment. The supernatural dread that filled the room was palpable now, a living thing that wrapped around them like a shroud. Ryan's nose began to bleed without warning, dark droplets powdering onto the linoleum floor in perfect time with the resumed knocking from the cupboard. The lights flickered then, once, twice, 3 times, before plunging them into darkness. In the black void of room 207, their other senses heightened painfully. They could hear each other's rapid breathing, smell the fierce sweat soaking through their uniforms, feel the vibrations of the knocking through the soles of their shoes. When the emergency lights finally kicked in, casting everything in a sickly green glow, they wished they'd stayed in darkness. The walls were different. Writing covered every surface, names, dates, pleas for help, in what looked horribly like dried blood. And every single inscription ended with the same phrase, room 207 wasn't supposed to be occupied. Cassie was the first to notice that the padlock on the cupboard was now hanging open, swinging gently as though someone had just unlocked it. None of them had moved near it, they were dead certain of that. The macabre implications weren't lost on any of them as they stared, frozen in horror. Should they run? But the door was still locked. Should they call for help? But their phones showed no signal. Should they open the cupboard themselves, confront whatever waited inside? The mere thought filled them with medo so intense it was physically painful, a vice grip around their hearts that threatened to stop them beating altogether. "We need to know," said Janie finally, her voice barely audible. As the only one whose family had been at the school long enough to remember the incident, she felt a strange responsibility. "My sister said after the fire, they found..." But before she could finish, the cupboard door began to open on its own, slowly, inch by a terrorizing inch. The hinges creaked a warning, like a final chance to look away before seeing something that couldn't be unseen. But none of them could tear their eyes from the widening gap, from the darkness that seemed too absolute, too dense to be natural. A small hand appeared first, pale, dirty, with blackened fingernails that had clearly clawed at something for a very long time. It gripped the edge of the door, knuckles white with the effort. The skin didn't look right, too papery, too dry to belong to a living person. Yet it moved with terrible purpose, pulling the door wider to reveal nothing. The cupboard was empty. No, not empty, there was a small wooden chair inside, child-sized, facing the wall. And scratched into the back wall, fresh enough that dust still fell from the grooves. I'm standing behind you now. The sobrenatural terror of that moment would stay with them forever, the certainty that they were no longer alone in room 207. What happened next defies explanation, though each survivor has their own version. The official report states that a faulty electrical system triggered both the lockdown and a small fire, causing mass hysteria among 6 students found in an unauthorized area. But those who were in room 207 know the truth. The classroom temperature rose suddenly, climbing until the air shimmered and their skin blistered. The sprinklers didn't activate. The alarms didn't sound. The irrepiant wail that filled the room didn't come from any emergency system, but from something that moved among them, brushing against them with touches too light to be felt but somehow leaving bruises that wouldn't fade for weeks. They don't remember how they got out. The next clear memory any of them has is standing in the schoolyard, dripping wet though there had been no rain, staring up at the window of room 207 where a figure stood watching them, a small silhouette with its hand pressed against the glass. By the time teachers reached them, the figure was gone, and the window showed only the reflection of clouds. But the photograph taken by the school newsletter that day tells a different story. In the background, barely noticeable unless you're looking for it, a room 207, its window clearly showing not clouds but the face of a child none of them recognized, mouth open in what might have been a scream or a laugh. The school board tried to hush it up, of course. Faulty wiring, mass suggestion, shared hallucination, they had a dozen explanations, each more desperate than the last. The room was sealed again, this time with concrete filling the doorway. Just a precaution, the principal assured worried parents. Structural concerns. But the students knew better. They'd felt the macabre presence that had been trapped in that room, possibly for decades. They'd heard its whispers, felt its touch, smelled the distinctive odor of its rage. And none of them could shake the feeling that sealing the room had been exactly what it wanted, not to keep something in, but to keep something out. Us, perhaps. Or help. 3 weeks later, during routine maintenance, a worker discovered something troubling in the old building plans. Room 207 shouldn't exist. The original blueprints showed a solid wall where that classroom stood, an architectural impossibility that no one could explain. Even more disturbing was what they found when drilling through the concrete that sealed the door: nothing. No classroom, no scorched walls, no cupboard. Just an empty shaft that seemed to descend much farther than the single-story building should allow. The meter that gripped the maintenance crew was so severe that 2 men quit on the spot, refusing to ever set foot on school grounds again. The hole was hastily sealed, the investigation quietly abandoned. But the story doesn't end there. The 6 students who experienced room 207 found themselves changed in subtle ways. They would wake at exactly 2:07 each morning, regardless of time zone or circumstance. They would find themselves drawing the same symbol repeatedly, unconsciously, a simple design resembling a key inside a flame. And most to terrorize Annie of all, they began to notice certain students in the hallways, wearing the correct uniform, carrying the right books, answering when called upon, whom no one else seemed to acknowledge. Students who would smile knowingly when their eyes met, who would whisper room 207 as they passed, who would be gone when looked for directly. The most troubling development came 6 months later, when renovation work began on the East Wing. A new classroom was to be built, designated room 306. The construction crew reported unusual difficulties, tools disappearing, unexplained cold spots, voices in empty corridors. But they persisted, completing the room despite their misgivings. On the first day of its use, a substitute teacher unfamiliar with the school's history directed a group of students there during an unexpected lockdown drill. As they settled in to wait, one student noticed something odd about the supply cupboard at the back of the room. It was identical to the one they described from room 207, down to the scratches on the handle. And as they watched in sobrenatural horror, they heard it, the soft, deliberate tap-tap-tap of someone asking to be let out. Have you ever wondered what happens to a place that witnesses something terrible? Does the wood absorb the screams, the concrete soak up the spilled blood, the very air remember the meter that once saturated it? Room 207 wasn't supposed to be occupied, but then again, neither was room 306. Yet something drew those students there, something remembered them, recognized them. As the new group of students stared at the cupboard, the tapping growing more insistent by the second, they couldn't help but feel they were experiencing something cyclical, something that had happened before and would happen again. The macabre dance of history repeating itself in rooms that shouldn't exist, with entities that shouldn't be possible. It started during the annual night lockdown drill at Westlake Academy. The staff and students were scattered throughout the darkened buildings, following protocol to absolute perfection. No one was meant to move or speak. Yet amidst this orchestrated silence, something terrorizing was unfolding in the security room where Deputy Principal Harrison sat monitoring the CCTV feeds. A lone figure walked calmly through the west corridor, a boy in the school's distinct navy blazer and gray trousers, moving with purpose despite the lockdown announcement that had blared through every speaker just minutes before. "Who the bloody hell is that?" Harrison muttered, reaching for his radio. The figure moved with an eerie steadiness, never rushing, never hesitating. The security cameras captured his progress from multiple angles, yet his face remained obscured, either by shadow or by the oripient way he seemed to know exactly where each camera was positioned. Harrison dispatched 2 staff members to intercept the student, assuming it was just some cocky Year 10 larrikin who thought rules didn't apply to him. But when the teachers reached the East Wing, there was no one there. Every classroom was locked, every corridor empty. When they reviewed the footage again, Ms. Kendall, who'd been teaching at Westlake for nearly 3 decades, went white as a ghost. "I know that uniform," she whispered, pointing at the screen. "That's not our current uniform. Look at the blazer trim, that's the centenary design. We haven't used that since 2010. The next morning, a thorough search revealed nothing unusual. Harrison decided to keep the incident quiet, no use causing supernatural panic over what was probably just some kid in an old uniform having a laugh. But his curiosity got the better of him, and he began searching through yearbooks from 2010. After hours of comparing the blurry security images to hundreds of student photographs, he found no match. That might have been the end of it, if not for what happened when Harrison decided to check previous lockdown recordings. At first, he told himself he was just being thorough. But deep down, there was a medo he couldn't articulate, a nagging suspicion that had him scrolling through months of archived security footage. The first instance he found was from the previous year's lockdown drill. Same time of night, same empty corridors, and there he was. The same boy, in the same outdated uniform, taking the exact same path through the school. Harrison felt the blood drain from his face as he checked the date, April 17, 2023. The exact same date as this year's drill. Harrison's obsession grew over the following weeks. He requested security archives from before his time at the school, going back as far as digital records would allow. The pattern held true. Every April 17th, during the lockdown drill, the boy appeared. Sometimes the camera angles were different, the quality poorer in older footage, but there was no mistaking the figure in the outdated uniform. No one could explain how the same person could appear in recordings spanning more than a decade, never aging, never changing. The macabre implications kept Harrison awake at night, staring at his ceiling and wondering if he was losing his mind. Ms. Kendall was the only other staff member who seemed to take the matter seriously. "There's something you should know about the East Wing," she told Harrison one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. Before the renovation in 2011, there was an incident during a lockdown drill. She wouldn't elaborate on what kind of incident, only that it had been serious enough to fast-track the planned renovation, completely gutting and redesigning that section of the school. There was a reason they stopped holding the drills on April 17th after that year. Or at least, there was supposed to be. That's when Harrison made the connection. The school administration had changed 3 times since 2011. Policies had been updated, schedules revised. Somewhere along the way, the significance of April 17th had been forgotten, the date restriction dropped from the lockdown protocol. This year's drill had been the first to fall on that date since the incident. The supernatural coincidence sent a chill down Harrison's spine. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Harrison had enlisted the help of the school's IT specialist to enhance some of the older footage. "I've been running these images through some recognition software," Jamal explained, pointing to his monitor where several screenshots from different years were displayed side by side. "And I've found something weird." The boy's face, it's different in each recording. Harrison leaned closer, heart pounding. Jamal was right. Though the uniform and posture remained consistent, the facial features subtly changed from year to year. It's like the uniform is wearing different people," Jamal whispered, giving voice to the terrorizing thought that had just formed in Harrison's mind. Despite Kendall's reluctance, Harrison knew he needed to learn more about the incident she'd mentioned. The school records from 2011 were frustratingly vague, just a note about emergency renovations approved for the East Wing following structural concerns. The local newspaper archives weren't much help either. Every lead seemed to end in a dead end. All except one, the caretaker, old Bobby, who'd been at Westlake longer than anyone. "They swore us all to secrecy," Bobby finally said, his weathered face grave. "Made us sign papers and everything." He wiped his hands on his overalls, leaving dark smudges that looked disturbingly like blood against the faded fabric. It was during the lockdown drill. A boy got trapped in the old storage room in the East Wing. No one knew he was there. He wasn't supposed to be at school that late. By the time they found him the next morning, it was too late. "Asthma attack," they said. But that doesn't explain why the room was locked from the outside, does it? Or why his uniform was missing when they found him. The supernatural horror of the story sat heavy in Harrison's stomach. A boy had died, alone and afraid, during a lockdown drill. On April 17, 2011. Wearing the centenary uniform that had been replaced just months later. "What was his name?" Harrison asked. Bobby shook his head. "That's the strangest part. No one seems to remember. It's like he never existed. No student was reported missing. No death certificate was filed. The renovations started the next day, and by the time school resumed, that storage room was gone." Harrison couldn't sleep that night, his mind racing with implications. A boy no one remembered, who may not have officially existed, had died during a lockdown drill. And now, every year on the anniversary of his death, something wearing his uniform walked the same halls, following the same path to the place where he'd taken his last breath, a place that no longer existed in its original form. The meter wasn't just about ghosts or hauntings anymore. It was about what this meant for reality itself. The answer came sooner than Harrison expected. 3 days after his conversation with Bobby, he was working late when the lights flickered. The security monitor on his wall showed the west corridor, empty and dark as it should be. But there, at the far end, was a figure in a navy blazer with centenary trim. Standing perfectly still, facing the camera. Facing him. Harrison's phone rang. It was the night security guard. "Sir, you need to see this. All the cameras, it's on all of them. Just standing there. Looking at us." Indeed, when Harrison pulled up the security feed on his computer, every camera in the school showed the same image: the boy in the uniform, standing still, looking directly into each lens simultaneously. An impossible sight that defied all logic. It wasn't April 17th. It wasn't during a lockdown drill. As he watched, frozen in macabre fascination, the boy on every screen raised his hand simultaneously, pointing directly ahead. Then, with movements too synchronized to be natural, each figure took one step forward, then another, walking toward each camera from multiple locations at once. Harrison ordered a full lockdown. Alarm bells began to ring throughout the school, automatic locks engaging on all external doors. On every screen, the boy came closer, his face still obscured. Then, as if responding to the lockdown announcement, all 12 figures stopped in perfect unison. Heads tilted, listening. And then, all at once, they smiled, too wide, too knowing, containing something that had never been human despite its outward appearance. As Harrison reached for the door handle, the lights went out, plunging the office into darkness broken only by the glow of his computer screen. And on that screen, all cameras now showed empty corridors. Whatever had been walking toward him had vanished from the digital eye, which could only mean one thing: it no longer needed to be seen through technology. The temperature in the office dropped dramatically, his breath clouding in front of his face. Something was scratching gently at his door. When the noise stopped, Harrison finally examined the door with his phone's flashlight. The message carved into the wood from the outside was simple but terrorizing: "I remember you from the East Wing." But Harrison had never worked in the East Wing. He'd only been at Westlake for 3 years, long after the renovations. As this confusion washed over him, another realization struck: he couldn't remember what he'd been doing on April 17, 2011. Fragments of memory flashed through his mind: a different school, a different position, a favor for a colleague that had brought him to Westlake for one night only. A night when he'd helped supervise a lockdown drill. A night when he'd been assigned to check the East Wing and had found all rooms secure, including a storage closet with a faulty lock that he'd secured with his own padlock. The macabre understanding dawned as he stared at the scratched message. He had been there. He had locked that door. Harrison's phone lit up with a text from the security guard: "CCTV back online. Boy gone from all feeds except one. E-wing storage area, but that room doesn't exist anymore." Harrison pulled up the security app on his phone. A camera that shouldn't exist, showing a room that had been demolished years ago. The boy slowly turned around, finally showing his face clearly for the first time. The supernatural shock of recognition hit Harrison like a physical blow. The face was young, terrified, and completely, undeniably his own. A teenage version of himself stared out from the screen, mouth moving in words Harrison could somehow hear in his mind: "You left me there to die. Now I'm coming back for you. Every year, in every possible reality, until I find the one who did this to me." The next morning, Harrison submitted his resignation. As he walked through the school gates for the last time, he glanced back at the East Wing. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement at one of the windows, a flash of navy blue with centenary trim. The terrorizing truth would follow him no matter where he went. He wasn't just being haunted by a ghost in a school uniform, he was being hunted by himself across multiple realities. The boy would keep appearing in security footage, year after year, during each lockdown drill. The supernatural game of cosmic hide-and-seek would continue until balance was restored, until predator became prey, and the loop could finally close. The lockdown announcement came exactly at 2:17 p.m. Students at Blackwater High were used to these drills. They happened once a term, always with the same reassuring voice of Principal Thornton. "Attention, all staff and students. This is a lockdown." But something was off this time. The teachers felt at first a subtle wrongness in the tone, a macabre quality to the pauses between words. It was Principal Thornton's voice, yet somehow, not. Ms. Rivera's Year 11 English class followed protocol, moving away from windows, lowering blinds, locking the door. But the teacher stood frozen by her desk, head tilted toward the ceiling speaker, a look of genuine meadow crossing her face. "Ms. Rivera," whispered Ellie from the back corner. "Shouldn't we turn off the lights?" The teacher didn't respond immediately. When she finally turned to her students, her expression had changed to something they'd never seen before. "That's not Principal Thornton," she said softly. "Something's wrong." The voice on the intercom continued, its cadence becoming increasingly strange. The words were correct, the standard lockdown script, but the delivery had taken on an terrorizing quality. The pitch dropped unnaturally low at times, then swooped high without warning. Pauses stretched where there shouldn't be any. "Please, remain quiet until further notice." Several students exchanged uneasy glances, finally sensing what Ms. Rivera had detected immediately: this wasn't right. "I'm calling the office," Ms. Rivera decided, pulling out her mobile phone. The students watched in tense silence as she waited. After 30 seconds, she lowered the phone, her face paler than before. "The line's dead," she whispered. She'd never felt the sobrenatural dread that now crept up her spine as the voice began a countdown. 10 minutes of silence begins, now. Principal Thornton had never done a countdown before. The classroom fell into heavy silence. Outside in the corridor, footsteps echoed slowly past their door, measured, deliberate steps that seemed too heavy to belong to a student or teacher. The footsteps paused briefly outside their classroom, and everyone held their breath, the meter in the room a tangible presence now. Ms. Rivera made a decision. Protocol stated they should stay put until the all clear, but every instinct told her something was deeply wrong. "Stay here," she instructed her class. "Don't make a sound. Don't open the door for anyone except me." Before they could protest, she had slipped out, closing the door silently behind her. The students stared at each other in stunned silence. Ms. Rivera had just broken the most fundamental rule of lockdown: never leave your secure location. 5 minutes passed. 10. The countdown on the intercom should have ended, but there was no all-clear announcement. Jamal, seated nearest the window, carefully shifted the blinds to peek outside. What he saw made him jerk back violently. "There's no one out there," he hissed. "The oval should be full of PE classes right now, but it's empty. And all the buildings look dark." The macabre implications hung in the air. If this was a real emergency, other classes would be visible in their rooms. Unless they were the only ones left. The intercom crackled to life again. The voice that emerged was no longer pretending to be Principal Thornton. It was lower, wetter somehow, as if speaking through liquid. "My apologies for the deception," it said, each word carefully enunciated. "But I needed everyone in place. Especially Ms. Rivera's class in room 108. You're very special to me. I've been waiting a long time to meet you." The terrorizante personalization sent a collective shudder through the students. How did it know which classroom they were in? How did it know Ms. Rivera had left? "This isn't real," muttered Ben, the skeptic of the class. "It's part of the drill." But his voice lacked conviction. The voice on the intercom seemed to sense their doubts, chuckling softly. "You think this is a test? Perhaps you need more convincing." The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into a darkness broken only by the weak afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. In that semi-darkness, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped noticeably, their breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. The meter reached a crescendo as something scratched gently at the classroom door, not knocking, just letting them know it was there. When the lights flickered back on, they collectively gasped at what had appeared on the whiteboard, a message written in what looked horribly like dried blood: "I am not outside your door. I am already inside." The intercom crackled again, the voice now sounding amused. "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you." "Not exactly. I just need a volunteer. Someone to be my voice when this is over. It gets so lonely in the spaces between the walls, between the wires." Principal Thornton was accommodating for a while, but he's grown resistant. The macabre suggestion that the principal had been somehow compromised sent a wave of nausea through the group. "What are you?" Ellie finally asked, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm what happens when a place absorbs too much fear, too much pain. I'm what grows in the dark corners of institution buildings where children suffer. Some might call me a ghost, but that's not quite right. I'm more collective." As it spoke, the air in one corner of the room began to shimmer and distort. Something was taking shape there, something that seemed to be constructed from shadows and negative space, with only the vague suggestion of a human form. The figure solidified enough to see it was wearing what appeared to be an outdated version of their school uniform, though the details kept shifting. Its face remained mercifully obscured, a dark void where features should be. The sobrenatural presence it emanated was overwhelming, ancient and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. When it spoke again, they realized with horror that its voice came not from the intercom but from the figure itself. You're wondering about your classmates in other rooms, your teachers, your principal. Don't worry. They're experiencing their own versions of this conversation. Outside the classroom, chaos had descended on Blackwater High. Security footage would later show doors opening and closing on their own, lights flickering in patterns that spelled out words in Morse code, and most disturbing of all, Principal Thornton calmly walking the corridors with a blank expression, occasionally stopping to stand motionless for minutes at a time. But in room 108, 15 students faced the physical manifestation of the school's darkest energies. "What do you want from us?" asked Jamal. The figure drifted closer, the temperature dropping further with each inch it advanced. "I told you. A volunteer. A voice. Someone young enough to be adaptable." Its attention seemed to focus on Ellie. "You would be perfect. You've felt me before, haven't you? In the emptiness of the auditorium after hours? In the echo of the swimming pool when you stayed late for practice? You've always known this building holds more than just classrooms and corridors." The entity closed the distance between them, the void of its face beginning to shimmer, features attempting to form and dissolve in rapid succession. "Don't be afraid," it said, its voice modulating to something almost gentle. "It's not death I'm offering. Just partnership. Your consciousness alongside mine in the infrastructure of this place. All I ask in return is occasional use of your voice, your form." For a moment, the room held its breath. Then the classroom door burst open. Ms. Rivera stood in the doorway, pale but alive, clutching what appeared to be an ancient leather-bound book. "Get away from her," she commanded. "I know what you are now. I know your name." The figure whirled toward her, its form destabilizing at the edges. "You were supposed to find my history, yes, but not my binding," it hissed. "Where did you find that? It should have been destroyed decades ago." Ms. Rivera stepped fully into the classroom. "Principal Thornton told me where to look before you took full control of him. He's been fighting you for weeks." She held up the book. "A binding ritual performed in 1953, when they built this place on the site of the old asylum. They thought they could contain you in the foundation, in the electrical system." The entity's form flickered violently. "I am not some simple ghost," it snarled. "I am the collective suffering of hundreds of souls who were tortured, abandoned, forgotten in the asylum that once stood here. The fools who built this school thought a simple binding spell would keep me dormant. But children bring such delicious emotions, fear, anxiety, despair. I've been feeding, growing stronger year by year." Ms. Rivera began to read from the book, not in Latin but in plain English, a revision of the original binding. "By our knowledge and collective will, we bind the entity known as the composite to the electrical systems of Blackwater High School. It may observe but not interact, it may exist but not influence, it may remain but not manifest." The entity shrieked, a sound so terrorizante that several students covered their ears. Its form began to unravel at the edges, wisps of shadow being pulled back toward the intercom speaker. "This changes nothing," it howled as it diminished. "I've been patient for 70 years. I can be patient again. Rules change. Buildings are renovated. Technology is replaced. Sooner or later, someone will make a mistake, will forget the binding words during routine maintenance. And I'll be waiting." With a final wail that made the lights flicker throughout the building, the entity was gone, compressed back into the electrical system. The supernatural chill gradually lifted. Principal Thornton appeared at the door, looking disheveled and confused. "Is everyone all right?" he asked. "The lockdown system malfunctioned somehow, false alarm. But the strangest thing? I can't remember the last few hours at all." In the days that followed, an official explanation was circulated: an electrical fault had caused irregularities in the intercom system. Most of the school accepted this without question. But for Ms. Rivera's class, nothing would ever be quite the same. They now moved through the school with a heightened awareness, noticing things others didn't, how the lights sometimes flickered in specific patterns when certain topics were discussed, and how the morning announcements occasionally contained odd pauses or subtle distortions. The meter wasn't paralyzing, more a constant awareness that they shared their school with something ancient and patient. Years later, they would still occasionally feel it, that prickle at the back of the neck when passing a school intercom, that subtle static on the radio that almost formed words. And sometimes, during lockdown drills when the school fell silent, you might hear it, that slight distortion in the principal's voice, that subtle wrongness in the cadence that suggested something else was listening, waiting, patient beyond human understanding. Something that promised, sooner or later, someone will make a mistake.